I am here with Pete, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat about propaganda and who puts it out. So obviously we know about Russian propaganda, and all of us, the West has become aware of Chinese propaganda as well that's starting to infiltrate our systems. Now, why is Russian propaganda so advanced, Pete, and how does it differ from Chinese propaganda? Because there's no question that we're suffering from an onslaught of both at the same time.
Well, it's highly established over many, many decades. So propaganda known as Maskirovka has been part of Russian military doctrine since Tsar Nicholas. So you're talking about 100 years of the development of an infrastructure, a strategy, the investment of resources. So simply from a chronological standpoint, it has a few decades advantage over Chinese propaganda, which you can't even say started from the time of the 40s or the 50s, because they had to go through the Cultural Revolution. They found their place in the world. So the Russians have for nearly 100 years been packaging messages to suit their advantage in geopolitics, the Chinese less so. But, you'd have to venture to say the Chinese are catching up fast. Simply because of their ambition. One of the starkest things I've recently come across is Chinese censors needed to be educated on what Tiananmen Square actually was. Indoctrination had been so thorough that young people coming in to work as censors actually had no knowledge of what they needed to censor. They had no memory, they had no perspective on Tiananmen Square ever actually having occurred. So that's a whole another level of bizarre when you actually have to teach your censors about a suppressed history in order that they can look out for it in people's feeds. So for all its faults, Russia is a society that probably has a little bit more access to alternative sorts of information. You can still get Western news sources if you look for them, if you choose to look for them. The Chinese, on the other hand, are much more technologically adept at filtering all that stuff out. So, there's no secret that a communist system is always going to be a lot more authoritarian than a strange kind of mafia dictatorship as we see in Russia.
Well, you say it's strange that they didn't know about, the Chinese didn't know about their own history, but I mean, look at our kids today in school. They do not know the history of the colonials. They don't know what happened in Australia. They don't know about the gold rush. They don't know about all the settlers that came here. They only know what they've been told by what are basically in-house propaganda agents about this new fake rewritten history, which is pretty much based upon racial grievance. Now, you can say, oh, well, the Chinese don't know, but if you ask them any question about an historical event in Australia, they would not be able to tell you. You'd have to sit them down and re-educate them, and that's how bad it is here. But the question is, we know that Russia's trying to influence Australia. We've got the whole TikTok fiasco where they've been pulled up for subverting or infiltrating the young minds through their app that they've got. I think the US is trying to ban it or has banned it. Why doesn't the West play the game of propaganda with other nations? Why do we sit back and the only people we seem to corrupt are our own citizens?
That's a very solid observation. I think I share your assessment that the West is naive about the degree to which it's being subjected to Russian influence and Chinese influence and authoritarian interest, generally speaking. In particular, the degree to which authoritarian societies look at our own conflicts, look at our own controversies, and pour fuel on those fires, right? It's a bit like surfing. You look for the waves that are out there and you jump on them. And as soon as they see a controversy in our society, sure enough, they latch on to that to breed this kind of dissension within. We talked earlier about technocracy and about how increasingly a lot of our leadership is about technocratic decisions and this kind of banality. I really do think that, that in a funny kind of, not in a funny kind of way, in a sad kind of way, we've divorced ourselves from the very principles and values and foundations on which we were founded. And we go along managing governments as if their only job is to minimize risk, as opposed to espouse particular beliefs, espouse particular values. Name for me a current leader that's out there basically actively talking about the defense of democracy. So, why don't we project strategic communications into those societies? Why are our own counter-propaganda efforts not strong enough? It's probably because we have weak leadership that, is schooled in a politics that basically says my job is basically just to put out these little domestic fires here and there and to collect 51%.
Our leaders actually remind me of those monks who sit there smacking themselves in the back with the whip and just punishing themselves continuously instead of going out there and promoting maximum prosperity and maximum liberty to make our cultures robust and strong, because risk will minimize itself as your culture becomes stronger. Attempting to make a risk smaller actually makes your country more dangerous. That's just what happens in society. But I mean, obviously Russia didn't wake up a few years ago and decide to start bombarding the West with propaganda. I mean, even if you were to say that, the internet made this influx of Russian propaganda available to reach the Western youth, the late 90s and early 2000s, it didn't really start corrupting that Western youth straight away. I used to be on a platform called LiveJournal. That was a big American platform for social media early on that was then sold to the Russians. And they tried to contain all the Western youth on there. And what happened was they all just left. They weren't going to be done over by Russian propaganda. But now it seems as if, and I may be imagining it, but that the children are easier to corrupt. Would you say that's fair, that somehow if you become weaker in mind and weaker in your own philosophy, you're easier to subvert with propaganda?
Indeed. If we basically reduce truth down to a personal choice, it's very difficult to basically bring people together around any kind of objective reality. Take a look at the campuses in the United States at the moment, and where you've got Columbia, my alma mater, Yale, considered the best university in the country in the United States, with active anti-Israel protests, actively putting forward anti-Semitic agendas, et cetera, et cetera. These are our future leaders. These are the people who are going to run the United States. And you go, my goodness. And they come from predominantly wealthy families, from the best high schools, et cetera, and yet they're involved in this kind of fringe left-wing radicalism. And you go, what is going on that we basically have sacrificed our own way of thinking and our own way of being? It really is quite frightening.
Well, that's happened before when the children of the wealthy elite decided that fascism and communism was cool, and it didn't end well for the world when that went down. But a lot of people by this stage have seen the famous YouTube video featuring Yuri, the Soviet KGB defector, who explained the psychological warfare, subversion and control of Western civilization. Here's a quick clip for our audience so they can see what we're talking about.
Soviet terminology means always a destructive, aggressive activity aimed to destroy the country, nation, or geographical area of your enemy. So there's no romantics in there, absolutely. No blowing up bridges, no microfilms in Coca-Cola cans, nothing of that sort. No James Bond nonsense. It's most of this activity is overt, legitimate, and easily observable if you give yourself time and trouble to observe it.
He's basically saying that the subversion of our society via propaganda is done out in the open. You can go and look at it. You can go and see them writing about it. And yet somehow we manage to be hoodwinked into it. Now, is that something that we hear anybody actually talk about in our West? Are our leaders even concerned about these overt programs, or do they just ignore that they're happening entirely?
There is, for instance, a fact-checking platform in Ukraine that monitors the amount of Russian propaganda that appears in Western European media outlets. And on a monthly basis, let's say in a place like Poland, Germany, or Slovakia, or France, or Spain, they record instances of up to 200 pieces of straight Russian propaganda that have been run by media outlets in those societies. So, you're talking about 3, 4, 5 pieces a day, where it's literally cut and paste from a Russian source into a Western media outlet. So if we're going to have such lax standards around discerning what is truthful, discerning what is objective, testing content, if you will, we're really going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble. I'm not sure what's happening in journalism schools at the moment, but a little bit of fact checking wouldn't go astray. A little bit less naivete about repeating the Russian side of the story, which is entirely fabricated, entirely fact-based. A society, a leadership that is lying on an industrial scale, and we're not actually putting a question mark against any of that before we subject our readers to it. That's kind of bad.
I think the school for journalism now is known as ChatGPT, and they just copy and paste answers from whatever the algorithm tells you. You laugh, but I mean, that is how they're doing medical school these days. That's how they're completing their assignments. So I wouldn't be surprised if journalism is just written by an algorithm put out by Google.